Hi, my name is Michael Smook. Today is April 7th. We're in the year 2018, and it's a Saturday. I'm speaking to you from my home in Forest Hills, New York. Forest Hills is in Queens County, which is an outer borough of the city of New York. Today, it's a memoir, this talk, episode 23, and it's entitled Lessons Learned. Today, I'll be talking to you about events that happened to me when I was a child, a teenager, as an adult, what I've learned from them at that time, and what I carry with me today now that I'm 62 years old. Let's go for an outline of today's talk, and then we'll move forward. The first story, chapter 2, is entitled A Conversation at My Grandparents'. The second story, chapter 3, is entitled Facing Down a Bully. The third story, chapter 4, is entitled It's Good to Ask Questions. And then chapter 5 is a summary. We'll summarize and then we'll say goodbye. Now that we've concluded chapter 1, let's move on to chapter 2. A Conversation at My Grandparents'. My grandparents, my paternal grandparents, that was the place to be on Sunday. And what I'm talking about is a sit-down meal in the dining room. It was in 1962 or 1963. And I was 7 or 8 years old at the time. And counting up all the people could have been there, including aunts and uncles and cousins, it was a party of about 17 people. And to accommodate all these people in the dining room, my father and or his brothers, my uncles, must have gone in the basement, and they must have brought up 1 or 2 leaves to extend the table. Now, this meal took place. It was a sit-down meal, and it was after lunch, which is 12 to 1, and it was before dinner, which is 5 to 6. So my guess, it was between 3 and 4 o'clock, and we'll call this meal supper. In terms of the sitting arrangements, my grandfather, like all patricians, sat at the head of the table. He put me to his immediate left, not because I was his favorite grandchild, but that's where he put me. And to his immediate right, he put my father, so I could look straight across the table into my father's eyes. And my mother sat next to my father. My siblings sat next to my mother. At the other end of the table was my paternal grandmother, who did most or all of the cooking. Sitting next to my grandmother was my great aunt, who she never married. She worked outside of the house, but she lived with them. And in between all these people sitting around the table were my aunts, uncles, and cousins. And since this was a late afternoon supper, my grandmother did most of the cooking. She either made chicken or brisket of beef. And before I knew it, even though we were crowded, I had a plate full of food sitting in front of me with a tall glass of Pepsi. Now, sitting next to my grandfather, my best move would have been to simply get to work on my food. Instead, I had other ideas. I wanted to sip some Pepsi and talk to my cousins. And I didn't get away with that very long. My grandfather was born in the old country, and he was an old school kind of guy, a man of few words. And he said to me, enough with the table talks, no refill of Pepsi, eat your food. And in that home and throughout the family, my paternal grandfather's words were the law. And in a vain attempt that I think I could appeal what my grandfather said, I looked across the dining room table at my father. And to my surprise, I saw that my father's eyes were focused directly on the plate in front of him. And he was eating his meal. He was eating his meal and focusing on this food in front of him. And there was no way I could signal my father. Blink my eyes, wiggle my nose, smile, shrug my shoulders, or receive the same from him. There was no way I could communicate with my father. And also, my father, who stood next to his father, my grandfather, my father was 40 or 41 at the time. And my father it was even less than remote that he would turn his head to the left and say to my paternal grandfather, "Dad, let me handle this one. You didn't do those things in those days." So I knew my best course of action was to eat the food in front of me. And that's what I did. The next thing I remember from this experience, it's either later that day or a day or two later, at my parents' home, the home I grew up in. And I said to my dad, I said, "Dad, what happened at Grandma and Grandpa's the other day?" And my father was a lot like his father. He was a man of few words, and he got to the point quickly. And he spoke with a rare degree of emotion I had never heard before. My father said to me, he said, "Look, you think it's easy growing up in our home? I had to live with my father, and if I wanted warmth and to get a hug, I had to go to my mother or my aunt. I love my father dearly, but he is what he is." And that's what I had to deal with. So what I learned from that conversation, the lesson learned from that conversation is that my father, as a child growing up, and now as a middle-aged 40, 41-year-old adult, had to manage his relationship with his father, and it took some work. And it started to give me an appreciation that it wasn't easy for my father either. The lesson that I relearned from that experience is that in those days, your parents, your aunts, your uncles, your teachers, any adult, when they said to do something, you never spoke back. You did what you were told to do. There was no answering back, no disruptive behavior. It was either yes sir, no sir. So basically what I relearned the lesson is always respect your elders. And that's basically sums up the lessons learned from chapter 2, A Conversation at My Grandparents', and what I gathered through conversations with my grandfather and my father. Now let's move on to chapter 3, Facing Down a Bully. This story takes place, I'm 14 years old, it was 1969 and 1970. I'm in third year of junior high. Now it's known as your freshman year of high school. And this event took place at homeroom in the beginning of the school day. Homeroom is where you, the teachers, 20 or 25 of your fellow students, you sat at a desk and you, when the teacher called out your name, you let the teacher know that you were there. And if you weren't there, you were either absent or late. And this is the way they took attendance before we had computers in the classroom. And also, we'd stand at attention with a hand over our heart, and we'd say the Pledge Allegiance to the flag. And that's what homeroom was basically about. And then you would go to your first class room. So what happened is I had a surprise visitor that day. I was on the wrestling team. I was on the varsity. And my arch rival on the wrestling team, who was junior varsity, came to the door. And he had this swagger about him and this confidence. And he had lots of friends and was popular. And I tried to not show it, but I was intimidated by him. And to add to the intimidation factor, he came to my homeroom, just outside the homeroom, with a very tall starting basketball player on the junior high team. And next to him on his left, my arch rival's left, was another tall fellow who was a starter on the baseball team. For the sake of this talk, we'll say my arch rival's name was Johnny. And Johnny wanted to get under my skin, and he wanted to shake me up by coming to me early in the morning. Before he left, because he had to get back to his homeroom to be accounted for and do the Pledge of Allegiance, before he left, in front of me, the teacher, and 20 to 25 of the fellow students, he shouts out, "Smook, you're a chicken. I challenge you to a wrestle-off later today, and I'm going to beat you." And what could I do other than smile? And he had to run back and be accounted for attendance. I knew there was one thing to do during the day. I sought out the junior high wrestling coach, and I spoke to Mr. Pepe, and I said, "I've been challenged to a wrestle-off, and I want to do this today." And he said, "By all means, let's do this." Now let's move on to later in the day during the wrestle-off, this titanic struggle against my arch rival. You have to understand this about my arch rival, the fellow who I'm intimidated by. The thing about it was he was new to wrestling. He's a very strong fellow. He was new to wrestling. The first time we wrestled, I beat him decisively. The second time we wrestled earlier in the year, I beat him narrowly. And then throughout the course of the year, he learned the same moves I already knew, and he was a real challenge to wrestle. And we would fight maybe on 4 occasions to a draw. And because I was already varsity and he couldn't beat me, I remained varsity and he remained junior varsity. And this is what I think was imagining going on in the mind of my arch rival, Johnny. He probably said to himself, look at Michael. He's this wimpy Jewish kid. How is he beating me? How come I can't beat him? So that's what I think was going on in his head. In that day, I managed to barely wrestle him to a draw, and I remained varsity, and he went back to being junior varsity. Johnny would try to get under my skin in other ways. We both had something called study hall. Study hall was a room you were supposed to go to. In between classes, do your homework, study for an exam, study for the lecture. He would come up to me and sit next to me. And on 3 or 4 occasions, he asked the same questions. And it was so he could feel better. He would say to me, what does your father do for a living? What kind of cars do your parents drive? How big is your home? Where do you go on vacations? So on and so forth. 2 or 3 or 4 other questions. So he would run through this each time, and naively, I would give him a truthful answer. And no matter what I said, he was living a better lifestyle than I was. And it didn't really bother me, but I thought it was rather curious that he would ask these series of questions on 3 or 4 times. We went through this exercise together. So I think it just simply made this fellow feel better by realizing he was living a better lifestyle than me since he couldn't beat me in wrestling. The thing about this arch rivalry is in 10th grade it started to cool off. I moved over to tennis. I wasn't a very good tennis player, but I was second doubles, and I managed to win a varsity letter in 10th and 11th grade. My friend Johnny moved over to lacrosse, and he left wrestling as well, and that's where he found his true niche in athletics. And he was a starter on the lacrosse team for 3 years. He was an all-star, and he had a storied career in high school athletics. And I suppose that satisfied him to a great degree. And he had lots of friends, other jocks. I didn't fit in that crowd. And but the thing about it is, in 10th grade, because he was receiving a measure of satisfaction on the lacrosse team, the relationship started to cool off. And so what happened was the thing that I remember is that it dissipated. In 11th and 12th grade, we no longer had this rivalry. I think the most important lesson I learned from all this is that in your life, you're going to have situations where you're challenged, where you don't feel comfortable, and you have to manage a situation, and you don't feel comfortable with yourself, and you need to, in baseball parlance, you need to step up to the plate, and you need to manage the situation. And that's what I learned about this situation with my friend Johnny. I was intimidated by him, but I faced the situation, and I did okay. And what I learned is in high school, college, in the world of work, in my personal life, I had all sorts of challenges, and I met the challenges, and a lot of times I succeeded. Sometimes I fell short, and then the times I fell short, I try again. And so the thing about it is, I learned not to be intimidated by my fears. So that was the most important lesson learned by my rivalry with Johnny. And as you could tell, I worked past the intimidation tactics by calling me a chicken in front of my peers. And what I remember about Johnny was after we graduated high school in 1973, if I thought about him at all, I thought to myself, well, I'm never going to see him again. And then 20 years after we graduated, my wife and I went to my 20th reunion. It's the first reunion, and this year we're going to be going to our sixth reunion, the 45th. And anyway, it's 1993. We go to the reunion. We're there for at least 2 or 3 hours. We say hello to quite a few people. We talk to them. The food is buffet style. We dance, and then after a period of time, it was time to go. So we put our coats on, and we were ready to leave. And then what happened is I'm practically out the door, and a familiar voice shouts out at me by my last name, "Smoot, come here." And I turned around, but who it is? Johnny. And he's at the other end of the room. And of course, I had to walk across the entire room to greet him. And I looked at him, and he outweighed me by about 20 pounds. And I smiled, and I said to him, "Johnny, we ain't wrestling tonight." And we both laughed. And he gave me a big bear hug, hello. And then we talked for about 2 or 3 minutes. And then that was it. I haven't seen him in 25 years since that encounter. But I think the lesson learned from all of this is that these rivalries that seem white hot at the time sometimes dissipate. And the nice thing about having grown past junior high and graduated high school and college, it's nice to know that we all can go out in the world, build a career, find a partner, have kids, own a home, and have a life. If you feel like you're in a role as a jock or geek in junior high or high school, you don't always have to be that way in your life. And the fact of the matter is that things change, and that's a pleasant lesson learned from the story 20 years after my rivalry with Johnny in the chapter 3, which is standing up to a bully. And now that we've concluded chapter 3, let's go to chapter 4. It's good to ask questions. This is what chapter 4 is about. The location of chapter 4, my wife and I belong to a tennis and pool club. And we go there on weekends from Memorial Day to Labor Day. And we don't play tennis so much, but we swim a lot. And my wife loves the kitchen, great salads. They have great barbecue. And when we stay late for dinner, the manager of this concession is also a gourmet chef. And he can make the same dish, but a half a dozen different ways. And he's terrific. And he takes good care of us, and we really like the food. And so the thing about it is that we have friends who come greet us, and we entertain visitors on the weekends as well. We like to read on the weekends. My wife is a sun person, and I'm a shade person. So we both put sunblock on. We both read. We both enjoy the pool, and we both forget about life. And we both enjoy the pool, and it's kind of a refuge to get away from everything. So the thing about this is, this summer it'll be, in 2018, it'll be 10 years with membership at this pool and tennis club. And what happened was in 2011, I was going through a deep depression. There were some changes at work. There were some other changes, challenges in my life and our lives as a couple, as a family, that were affecting me. And it was really very difficult for me to forget about it all at this pool, which is supposed to be a place where I do forget about it all. And I was in such a bad place. If somebody came up to me and said, "Michael, how do you feel? What's new?" I could talk 30, 60 minutes straight without taking a breath. And I had a conversation with myself. And I said to myself, look, you've got to turn a corner and start to work your way out of this depression. And the way to do that is that you need to change something. So what I told myself is, from now on, whether I'm talking to family, friends, coworkers, or acquaintances, from now on, I'm the one who's going to ask the question. So I'm going to say, How do you feel? What's new? What's going on? And then let them talk. And then if they said, well, what's going on with you? What I was going to do was I was going to keep it short. And I decided for that particular Sunday, I was going to practice and call up 2 friends. And then I called up one of my best friends from college. And we've known each other 30 plus years. And this is 7 years ago. This is when this happened, 2011. I call him up and I said to my one of my best buddies, I said, how are you? What's new? What's going on? And my friend said something very surprising to me. He said to me, my father just died. And I knew his father. I spent some time with my friend and his dad, and I was shocked, and I felt terrible for my friend. And also, what I was glad about from this conversation was I had timely had a conversation with myself, and I said, stop being so self-centered, start focusing on other people, and ask them what their problems are, and listen. Talk less, listen more, ask thoughtful questions. And that's what I learned out of this story, chapter 4. And the thing about this story is, it's a short one. We're going to summarize it in a second or two. What happened is, now since that happened, I don't ask those questions specifically in that way. This is what I do. Anybody 55 and up, I never ask them how they feel. I say, it's good to see you. And what's new? Something like that. Anybody 55 and up, I never ask them how they feel, because a lot of people have arthritis. They have chronic aches and pains and issues that they need to see a doctor about. And so that's a big change that I've made in my life. And I'm glad in 2011 I started to turn a corner, because I came to the realization that everybody has problems. People you see on the street, they're laughing. They look like they don't have a care in the world. Everybody has problems. They have problems with their kids. They have problems with their home. They have problems with money. Problems. And the fact of the matter is, I started to take the focus off me, and I started to turn a corner about getting past my depression. So that basically concludes chapter 4. And so now let's go on to summarize. So what we've done today is we've spoken about stories that took place when I was a small boy, when I was a teenager, and when I was an adult. When I was a small day, I learned that it wasn't easy for my father, dealing with his father, and to always respect your elders. That's chapter 2, conversation with my grandparents. Facing down a bully, what I learned was it's not only that exact situation where I'm dealing with somebody who intimidated me. What we discussed today is in life, from time to time, you're going to have challenges. You're going to feel outside your comfort zone. And sometimes it's best to have to plan in advance what you want to do, take some deep breaths, and do the best you can. And that's the lessons learned from that story. And then the last story is having to do with getting out of a depression, focusing on what's going on with other people, and talking less, listening more. And now today I simply say, it's good to see you, especially somebody in their 50s and 60s. And that about summarizes what today's talk's about. My name is Michael Smook. Today is April 7th. It's a Saturday, and we're in the year 2018. I'm speaking to you from my home in Forest Hills, New York. Forest Hills is in Queens County, which is an outer borough of the city of New York. Today it's a memoir, episode 23, and it's entitled Lessons Learned. Until next time, goodbye and good luck.